I wanted to start off by actually just getting a sense of who's in the room. So perhaps I could ask you to raise your hand if you are a lawyer or training to be a lawyer, perhaps. How about a scientist of some type or other? And if you've not raised your hand for either of those. Wonderful. And if you're online, then you're very welcome to raise your hand, but unfortunately I won't be able to see it. And then perhaps when we talk about the issue of causation in climate change litigation in particular, we're talking about the relationship between greenhouse gas emissions and the manifestations of climate change that result in losses for claimants. And perhaps I could also have a show of hands in the room for whether or not you think it would be possible, in principle, in climate-related lawsuits, to establish a causal relationship in law between greenhouse gas emissions and their consequences. So if you think that would be possible, would you raise your hand? And if not, would you raise your hand now? I think there have been a few abstentions. Why do you think it wouldn't be possible? If you don't mind me putting you on the spot.
I'm not sure at all, but I feel like it's super complicated to really show the causation because it affects everyone. Then how are you able to prove that it's going to affect the claimant in particular, and that in particular he is or she is a victim? Fantastic.
And I hope that over the next 20 minutes, my remarks will address perhaps some of those issues. There may, of course, remain issues of law, but in principle, at least, as an issue of science, I think, can clarify the facts of these sorts of cases. It can demonstrate the relationship that exists between greenhouse gas emissions and the consequences of climate change. And I really appreciated Professor Keller's remarks before. And I recognize the fact that science, or at least there may be a perception that science can sometimes complicate the facts. But I hope in the next few minutes I can show how science can also clarify, at least the factual basis for the claims being made before the courts. And when I'm talking about climate science today, I'm going to particularly focus on a branch of this science known as attribution science. It's developed over the last 2 decades or so, and it describes a set of scientific methods that addresses these sorts of causation issues in climate litigation. Some years ago, you would have heard the media often report, after some sort of extreme weather event had happened, that it's not possible to quantify the contribution that climate change makes, or that greenhouse gas emissions from human activity make, to any one weather event. That is no longer true. We have scientific methods that allow us to answer these questions. We can demonstrate the contribution that climate change makes to a wide range of weather events, be they heat waves, storms, droughts, floods, and also to rising sea levels and glacier retreat around the world. There may be some constraints in terms of certain types of events are more difficult to look at. It is also the case that not everything is caused exclusively or even substantially by climate change. But where that is the case, often we can, at least in scientific terms, demonstrate those things. And these facts mean that scientific developments can, in principle, provide a factual basis for the types of causal claims being made in growing numbers of lawsuits brought around the world. Specifically, these claims I mentioned before, that greenhouse gas emissions of one entity contribute to another's losses, or indeed the risk of losses. And over the next few minutes, I'll expand a little bit on the science that allows us to resolve those questions, develop insights there. But I'd like to start off with a case study from Peru. This is Laguna Palcococha in the Peruvian Andes, and behind it you see the Palcaraju Glacier. The photos were taken by the Austrian mountaineer and glaciologist Hans Kinzel in the 1930s. You see a medium-sized lake full to the brim, overflowing. And in 1941, a few years after those photos were taken, Laguna Palcacocha burst in what's called a glacial lake outburst flood, devastating parts of the city of Huaraz below it, killing at least 1,800 people. This photo showing large portions of the city still covered in debris and mud and silt was taken 6 years later. But over the last 70 years or so, the retreat of the Palcaraju Glacier has seen Laguna Palcacocha expand substantially. The lake is now substantially larger than it was after the 1941 flood, in fact 34 times larger in volume than it was in the 1950s. And this is despite efforts over decades to lower the lake levels, to install siphons to remove water from the lake. But nevertheless, the lake, as I say, is substantially larger than it was then, and it's considered to continue to present a serious danger to Huaraz below it. And the role of climate change in this story has come under particular scrutiny due to the gentleman on the left in this image. Saul Luciano Luya brought a case before the courts in Germany, arguing that under the Article 1004 of the German Civil Code, he, or RWE, a German energy company, should pay part of the costs of measures needed to protect the city in proportion to their historical contribution to climate change. And while the case was dismissed due to a range of factors, including difficulties in demonstrating the specific link between the emissions of one particular entity that you mentioned before and specific impacts of climate change manifesting in Peru in the first instance, on appeal, it's entered an evidentiary phase where two main scientific questions have emerged. The first being, is it indeed the case that the lake threatens the city? And the second, if so, is this climate change? Now, to give you an idea of the power of developments in climate science in resolving these sorts of questions, the sorts of evidence available to answer these questions when the case was first filed were those from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. It's an authoritative body of evidence that collects knowledge from across the scientific community and is directly accepted by governments. But the problem with IPCC evidence is it can be regional or global in scale, and in some cases as a result of this, and a result of the sort of negotiation process by which these consensus understandings of the science emerge, it can be relatively equivocal. So the sorts of statements that the case relied on in the first instance was that only more than half of the observed warming over the last 60 years was due to human influence on the climate. We now know, in fact, that essentially all the observed change in temperature is a consequence of human influence on the climate. And in fact, that particular quote comes from the fifth assessment report of the IPCC, and the very next sentence says that the best estimate is pretty much all the observed warming is attributable. On the glacier retreat side of things, which has created this flood risk that exists today, the statements were similarly equivocal, talking about the fact that glaciers worldwide are retreating in part due to increases in local temperature levels. But what developments in science allow us to do and allow us to understand in these sorts of settings is just how much climate change is affecting this specific setting. And some research with colleagues of mine in Oxford and in Seattle, we found that human-induced warming was responsible for virtually all, certainly 95% of the observed warming in the region around the glacier, and that the retreat of the glacier that led directly to this increase in flood risk was a direct consequence of that warming. It couldn't have happened due to natural variability alone, but moreover, our best estimate was essentially all the retreat of the glacier was attributable to this warming that in turn was a direct consequence of human activity. So this is the level of specificity which scientific methods allow us now to go into in understanding the role of climate change in a growing number of disasters or risks of disasters occurring around the world. And it's not only one study. In the last few years, studies like these have been conducted for a wide range of events around the world, both weather events, sea level rise, and other sorts of impacts of climate change. A substantial portion of these studies, all the red dots on the board behind me, found some role of climate change to a greater or lesser extent. And what we now have is an understanding of, for quite a number of events around the world, just to what extent climate change is playing a role. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was able to assimilate all of this evidence, which means that we now have regional understandings of how climate change is affecting different sorts of events. We see that pretty much worldwide, heat waves are getting hotter due to climate change, and we know that on the basis of all of this evidence. For many regions, we have enough evidence to show that heavy rainfall events that lead to floods are also getting stronger. And in some regions, we're seeing increases in drought also. All of this attributable to human influence on the climate. So we have the ability to conduct these specific studies. On the basis of that and the basis of expert interpretation, we also have an understanding of the regional changes that are happening as a result of human influence on the climate. And this could have a very influential role in legal settings. We know that causation is a key issue in many climate lawsuits. And to establish factual causation, we need both this general understanding that greenhouse gas emissions cause climate change, that climate change causes impacts of the type suffered by claimants in these cases, but also the specific causal link between, which may need to span the full causal chain, from the greenhouse gas emissions of a specific defendant right the way through to the specific losses suffered by the claimant in question. The body of scientific evidence we have now allows us to generally resolve these general causation questions very robustly, and specific attribution studies also allow us to interrogate these specific causation claims. It's not the case that everything is caused by climate change, but we can interrogate the evidence in terms of whether or not the specific harms in question are. For some time now, legal scholars have recognized the role that this form of scientific evidence can play in evaluating causal claims, and they've championed the role that climate change attribution science may have in resolving the growing number of climate lawsuits for which the relationship between greenhouse gas emissions and their impacts comes into question. But how does this all work? Well, scientifically, and without getting into too great a detail, at a high level, the questions that are asked are the following. If we want to understand the effect of climate change on extreme weather events, it's of course the case that these are not novel phenomena. We've always had floods, we've always had droughts. What climate change does, and the question we can ask of these events, is how much worse were these events because of human-induced climate change? Or how much more frequently are they happening? We have climate models and we've got observations, and combining them together allow us to basically simulate the world that would have existed in the absence of human-induced climate change. We can simulate that world using robust methods, as I say, robust methods that have been recognized by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And in so doing, we can quantify how an event of a certain type would have been different absent climate change. For slow onset trends, things like glacier retreat or rising sea levels, we can ask related questions. We can ask, could the observed changes, the retreat of this certain glacier or sea level rise in a particular location, could that have happened due to chance alone? Could that have happened just because of natural variability? We can also ask, rather than just, does this require climate change to have happened? We can say, to what extent was climate change responsible for this? We can quantify the proportional contributions of human and natural factors. And for glaciers, the studies that have been done around the world provides a compelling evidence that climate change is the primary driver, and particularly human-induced climate change is the primary driver of glacier retreat around the world. And that is also the case for sea level rise in the global mean, although it may vary slightly in certain regions where coasts may also be subsiding. So we have a powerful set of methods that allow us to quantify these facts, that allow us to understand the extent to which climate change is affecting these physical hazards that create losses. But this is about the role of climate change as a whole. Now, this quote comes from a US court, and now about 13 years ago or so. But in this, one of the early climate litigation cases brought by a village called Kivalina in Alaska, which was forced to relocate due to coastal erosion, the court stated that it was not plausible to state which emissions, emitted by whom and at what place in the world, caused the plaintiff's alleged global warming-related injuries, and that this was due to the fact that there were so many contributors to climate change that were allegedly responsible for the various chain of events allegedly leading to the erosion of Kivalina. In other words, in a world in which there are so many contributors to climate-related harms, is it possible really to pinpoint the contribution that any one entity makes? Now, unlike some other harms that happen outside the climate context, it's not the case that it is the molecules of carbon dioxide emitted by one country that causes one weather event and another country that causes another weather event, but rather all emissions are combined in the atmosphere, collectively result in global warming, and global warming in turn leads to the manifestations of climate change around the world. So all contributors to climate change contribute in part to the impacts of climate change we see. But scientifically, it's now possible, in fact, to quantify the extent to which individual greenhouse gas emitters have contributed to harms. Legally, you may not always need this information. It may be sufficient to quantify the role that climate change plays as a whole, and then allocate responsibility for contributions to harm based on some sort of market share approach or proportional approaches. But where it's necessary, scientifically, we can answer these questions. We can say to what extent are Shell's emissions or the emissions of the US responsible for certain extreme weather events, for sea level rise, for ocean warming and acidification. And we can do that both for events that have already happened and also for projections of changes that might happen in the future. There are studies that have done all of these things. We can quantify the contributions of countries or companies or even individuals, if need be. We can model the world as it would have been without Shell's emissions. We can model the world as it would have been without the emissions of Austria. So we have a set of methods that allow us to quantify the effects of climate change in a range of settings, or indeed individual contributors to climate change. But so far I've only spoken about physical manifestations of climate change. The strength of heat waves, the intensity of storms. What new developments in climate science also allow us to do is to extend these methods to the impacts of those events. It's now possible to synthesize methods from epidemiology and physiology to understand what are the health impacts of climate change. So we can quantify how many fewer deaths might have happened in a given summer in the absence of climate change. Or we can look at economic impacts or infrastructural damage resulting from these storms. And again, we can ask the question, in the absence of climate change, would these losses have occurred? Or how much less bad would the losses have been? And what these developments allow us to do is to answer the question to evaluate that full causal chain I described earlier on in the talk, right the way from the emissions of these individual entities, these individual contributors to climate change, and to demonstrate that those emissions may indeed contribute to losses suffered by, in the legal context, individual claimants. This particular figure on the bottom here shows heat-related, the stacks on the bottom. These are heat-related deaths occurring in the summer of 2018 in the canton of Zurich. And the darker red segments are all those heat-related deaths attributable to climate change. The lighter segments are those that would have occurred in the absence of climate change. We can even, using state-of-the-art methods in epidemiology combined with these climate science methods, we can say on any given day, in fact, how much cooler it would have been in the absence of climate change and how many fewer heat-related deaths, in statistical terms at least, would have happened. But there are still some challenges, and I don't want to come across as naive about how this sort of scientific insight might be interpreted legally. As I mentioned before, greenhouse gas emissions are fungible. They combine in the atmosphere And as I say, it's not the case that one hurricane was caused by Exxon, the next by Chevron. But legally, this is not exclusive to climate change. It's not a novel issue. There are many other impacts of certain human activities that combine in their contributions, lead to combined effects, and courts, using market share or proportional approaches, have found ways to allocate damages among defendants according to the proportion of emissions for which they're responsible. It would also be possible, as I said earlier, to quantify specifically what the magnitude of impacts would be in the absence of any one defendant's contributions, if need be. There's also the issue that I flagged right at the start, that the sorts of impacts of climate change we talk about in general are not these totally novel phenomena, that heat waves would have happened in the absence of climate change, that storms could have happened too. Again, we're able to quantify how much more likely these events are to occur, or how much more intense they are than they would otherwise have been. And once again, there are legal tests available that can understand whether or not the magnitude of these changes attributable to climate change would be sufficient to overcome causation tests. And then there's the issue that science, and climate science and attribution science is far from unique in this context, of course has some sources of uncertainty. When we conduct these studies, there's not only one number, but we give often a range of numbers that characterize the uncertainty we have in our results. It results from a range of different things, including the fact that we have not perfectly observed the world. Our models can't perfectly capture all these processes. But we understand really well what these sources of uncertainty are in general. We can quantify just how sensitive results are to uncertainty. And if the findings ultimately are robust to these sources of uncertainty, such that even essentially accounting for the sensitivity of our findings to these various sources of uncertainty, we can still demonstrate a contribution of climate change, then this may provide still a robust basis on which to make claims or to interrogate the claims being made. So the sensitivity of our results to these various methodological choices and sources of uncertainty, that can also be evaluated. And these developments in climate science occur in the context of broader changes in climate science that have allowed us to better understand the problem with which we're confronted. It's not only attribution, but also climate change projections give us increasing confidence that we know what will happen to various aspects of the climate system based on the choices made today, in terms of how much greenhouse gas emissions are produced in future. We understand to a great extent what the gravity of climate change impacts would be, depending or contingent on the greenhouse gas emissions we produce over the coming decades. Jan will probably speak more about this in the afternoon, but with climate change mitigation modeling, we have a better understanding of just what we need to do to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So we know what would happen if we continue to vent large amounts of carbon in the atmosphere. We also know where we need to go to meet our international obligations, international law under the Paris Agreement. And then lastly, there is this point that I've focused on in my remarks, that developments in attribution science, they demonstrate these scientific links between greenhouse gas emissions in companies or countries, the losses suffered by plaintiffs in climate lawsuits. Scientifically, the facts are relatively clear. In principle, all of this could support the establishment of legal causation. Now it's really a case of over to the lawyers for the legal interpretation side of all of this. And there will continue to be disputes over the specific interpretation of the science, but in principle, the facts are clear. Climate change is affecting a wide variety of events around the world. So attribution science, to conclude, has become widely recognized as an authoritative source of insight into the impacts of climate change. The studies that we conduct today can, if necessary, span the full causal chain from greenhouse gas emissions to the humanitarian or economic impacts of climate change. We know, of course, that not all disasters are direct or even substantially caused by climate change. But when that is the case, we are able to demonstrate just to what extent climate change is causing these impacts. One consequence of this for the legal community, of course, is that it's very important that we understand before bringing any one case whether or not it would be well grounded scientifically. And so there is a need to make sure that ahead of time there's this appropriate consultation between lawyers and scientists on the merits of certain claims, such that when the facts come to be interrogated in court, they stand up to scrutiny. But ultimately, the extent to which climate change is responsible for causing a wide range of climate-related harms can be quantified scientifically, and now it's up to the legal community to evaluate what those scientific facts mean in the context of legal standards of proof. So thank you very much, and I look forward to continuing to discuss in the Q&A and over coffee and lunch.
Thank you very much, Rupert. We are perfectly on time. It's 11:01. I have just one short question to you. You have alluded a lot to we. Could you explain a little bit who we is? Where are you talking from?
I think when I was using we in this context, primarily I was referring to myself and my scientific colleagues who can and do conduct these sorts of studies. It's of course, we have, as a scientific community, a range of methods, different approaches for answering these sorts of questions, and so it's not the case that everyone's doing exactly the same thing. But I think I was primarily using it sort of rhetorically to refer to what the scientific community as a whole is able to offer as insight and evidence in these sorts of settings.